This morning we are speaking to Stuart Bousel, playwright, director, actor extraordinaire, who is now directing Exit the King by Unesco, which will be showing at the Exit Theater in San Francisco until April 7th. Hello, Stuart.
Hello, Sarah.
How are you doing today on your beautiful day off?
My day off that still has 4 hours of rehearsal in it.
Yes. So
I'm doing great. I'm drinking English breakfast tea in my pajamas right now.
I am also drinking tea in my pajamas right now, so this is perfect. Tea in our pajamas with Stuart.
Excellent.
So Stuart, before we get into this play that's up right now, and congratulations on the stellar reviews, by the way.
I'd say they've been more like solid, but thank you. This play is very divisive. I'm not always sure I like this play, so I yeah.
Fantastic. I can't wait to get a little more into that. So before we talk about that, let me ask you, how did you end up here?
Physically here in San Francisco, I landed. I came here for the reason that you're never supposed to go anywhere, which is I moved out here for a relationship, and then that didn't really pan out. Which I knew when I moved out here it probably wasn't going to, but I chose this over New York, I think, because California seemed closer to home. I had already kind of grown up in the New York area. I didn't necessarily want to move back there, and there was kind of a possible romantic thing here that I just wasn't done yet with. But then I thought I was going to move out here for like 2 to 3 years, and then now I'm still here 15 years later. So that's a thing.
So the relationship didn't work out, but theater became your lusty mistress.
Way to put it back on track. Yeah. Well, theater. I mean, I've been doing theater for a really long time, but my father is a New Yorker and grew up in New York. Spent pretty much his whole life there. You know, he moved around a bit, but spent most of his life in New York. And in New York, there's just a much more of a culture of just theater going. Plus, my father grew up in like mid-century New York, which is when which was like the Broadway heyday, and also like the off-Broadway heyday. Like there was just a bajillion plays all the time, and like people just went to the theater for like $10, you know.
Yeah, and they dressed up and everything.
Yeah, my father even told me that it was actually really, because theater was so much cheaper then and so much more part of the normative culture of being a New Yorker, that like oftentimes people would just, you would go for the first act and you'd skip out on the second act, or you'd come in at intermission and sit down because, you'd already seen the first act another day, or all the good stuff was in the second act anyway. Like there was just much more of a kind of casual relationship with theater, which actually oftentimes made people more likely to see a lot of theater, at least the way he tells it. But yeah, so he loved theater, and my mother is very crafty. Like she's very oriented towards a more kind of visual art making type personality. But they're both kind of arty in their own way. And as soon as we were old enough to go to the theater, they took us to the theater, and so we were just kind of brought up watching theater, and both of my siblings, all three of us, went into performance. My brother is a musician. My sister is an actress and a costume designer and a singer. And, I think I was most attracted to the storytelling aspect of it because I just happen to really like how you can see things in your mind. Your mind can be projected on stage, and then the audience kind of can place themselves inside this sort of avatar that they see on stage in front of them.
Yes, it's like
I like that aspect of theater, but I mean, it's not. I definitely would say that I'm also still drawn to other types of storytelling. I mean, like almost every writer I know, I've been working on a novel for like a million years.
Right.
So it's not just theater, but theater is definitely my first love.
Yeah. So in regards to the play, I love nothing more than a mid-century revival of absurdist theater. Who doesn't love that?
I'm not sure I do, actually. But that's actually part of what made this whole process interesting is, part of what we do as you get older in your career, if you don't continue to try new stuff, and maybe stuff that doesn't necessarily appeal to you, or that you don't think of as your primary wheelhouse. Like, I think you get really stale. So a huge part of doing this show was kind of going on a bit of a wing for me. So
tell me about this relationship with Exit the King.
Well, so Exit the King was chosen by Christina Ogello, who is the artistic director of the Exit Theater, which is where it's playing, and where I have been fortunate enough to be a resident artist for a very long time. I'm not even quite sure when that relationship officially began, if it ever did. I think one day we were just like, yeah, this is where you are. But she approached me. I directed Christina in a couple projects, and we had a good rapport, and she said the Exit Theater has a long-standing relationship with Unesco. With Unesco, if you go into her office, there's actually a bunch of framed letters that she and Unesco exchanged when she was, in her 20s or 30s, and so right before he died, actually. And
wow,
for her, she really wanted to do the show. She'd seen the Broadway production with Jeffrey Rush and Susan Sarandon.
It was amazing.
And Lauren Ambrose was in that too, who I think is just incredible. And one of the saddest things is that I often have to explain to people who Lauren Ambrose is, which makes me really sad.
Right.
The show, she'd seen it in New York. She wanted to do it. It was kind of time for the Exit to do one again. She felt like, hey, like this is we haven't had one for a while, and so let's put on something by Unesco, and would you be interested in doing this, Stuart? Was kind of the next stage of that conversation. Like, I was the first director she approached because she felt like I had kind of more or less become the resident director at the Exit Theater. We also had Ariel Kraft, but Ariel Kraft has now moved on to Cutting Ball, where she's the artistic director, which is very exciting for her. She's moved on to a really awesome opportunity, and so I think, when Christina was shopping around for directors, it was probably either me or Ariel from her perspective, and she asked me to do it, and at first I was like, I don't really do Ionesco. Like, that was kind of my initial response, and Christina said, okay, well, I respect that. And then I said, let me read the play. So I read the play, and I thought, you know what, if there's one Ionesco I would do, this is it.
Yes.
This is the one play I would do by him. I would probably do Bald Soprano too, though maybe not. I mean, I think the reason why Bald Soprano is appealing to me is because it makes fun of English living room dramas, and I love English living room dramas. And so because I love English living room dramas, I would also be the first person to point out why they're kind of universally ridiculous. But which I feel that Bald Soprano does. But my problem with Bald Soprano has always been that I feel like it goes on just a little too long, which is kind of Ionesco's thing. Everything he does goes on just a little bit too long. And even with Exit the King, he actually suggests cuts. Like, when you get the script, he actually suggests about probably what amounts to about 25 minutes of cuts throughout the text, because even he recognizes it goes on a little too long for its own good. And we made about 15 minutes of those cuts we agreed with, and we kept about 10 minutes of his suggested dropped material. And actually, if I could change one thing about my current production,
yes,
I probably would now cut those 10 minutes as well.
Oh, wow. Okay, yeah.
Because I also still think the play goes on just a little too long. And that's kind of the point that he's making, though. Like, our struggle with death, our struggle with how to accept death as inevitable, is something that goes on longer than it probably should for something
right.
that we really don't have a choice about. And I get that, and I think that is brilliant, and I think that is noble, and artistically it's a big thing. I'm not sure that I love that as an audience member.
Oh. Well, it's interesting. I think Unesco is like tofu. You either love it or you don't. Right.
And it's funny because one of my favorite musicians describes her music that way too. She says, we're broccoli of bands. Like,
right.
I swear to God, we're good for you.
Let me ask you, you reminded me of a question I actually wanted to ask you regarding the script. Now, I know that Unesco loves to challenge the director and the actors with his scripts at times, and I know there are a few moments in this script where he sort of says, oh, just kind of figure it out, meaning there's one moment where Queen Marie, has to magically disappear off the stage.
Yeah, which we do. She does have a very dramatic exit. Like, I actually, as a playwright, I tend to write ridiculous stage directions too, and I usually put a caveat into the first page where I say stage directions are written for dramatic purposes. Figure it out any way you can. Just keep it theatrical. That's usually my guideline.
Right.
Like, I think any playwright after Arthur Miller who's really like expecting people to actually adhere to the stage directions is in for a rude awakening, because very few directors can.
Yes.
And also, like, it's so hard as a playwright to predict what the director's going to do or can do with the resources they have when they're in the room doing the show. And if you're going to be super strict about stuff like that, then you have to, I think you really have to sort of set yourself up to be disappointed there. But what I like about Unesco is that he recognizes his stage directions are kind of ridiculous, and oftentimes he kind of slightly throws in something like, however you can figure it out, this happens. Like,
he has a sense of humor really about it.
Yeah, what he's really trying to do, I think, in my opinion, is just convey a dramatic truth. I mean, Laura Dern talked about how when she was in Blue Velvet, that David Lynch, said, when you come into this moment, her very first appearance in Blue Velvet, and she, he said something to her to the effect, like, I want you to come in like a roll of thunder, or something like a soft roll of thunder. She was like, okay, like, what do you do with that? But the thing is that what he really meant is, I need you to really step in with, like, power, not like loudness. Like, your entrance is soft, but the moment you come in, it's like the world opens up, And I think that Ionesco is very similar. A lot of his things are imagist oriented, and it's less about actually realizing that image and more about challenging the interpreter to find a creative way to realize the intent.
Yes, I think that's fantastic. I think artists feed off challenge. I think most humans in general feed off challenge. Like, if we want to come full circle and talk about relationships, you were feeding off the challenge by coming to San Francisco, and then you were given a bigger challenge by building yourself up as this sort of theater warlord. Because you are fighting a war out there, like, we don't have a lot of money, we don't have a lot of time, and we have these big dreams, I
do refer to indie theater as trench warfare. I occasionally have said it's like trench warfare.
Yes. So I already know that you don't like to view yourself as a sort of soldier or warlord type, but maybe you are the kindly side man who has the pearls of wisdom, who saves the day in every Shakespearean play. How about that?
The tricky servant, as we used to say.
Yes. The wise, loving, gentle one.
Who I tend to think of myself as is actually, I usually see myself as the, if we're going to go with like Shakespeare figures, I actually oftentimes feel like I'm sort of the advisor who sees it for what it is and doesn't really get listened to, and then at the end he's like, well, there you go.
It's like, it's Timon's
Steward.
Yeah, Timon Steward.
Yeah, or I mean Horatio in Hamlet is who I've often related to.
Yes.
So
okay, so back to the play. Was there some insight that you gained from doing this play that you honestly feel like you didn't have before?
Oh yeah, and like, I don't regret doing this play at all, and that I want to make as clear as possible. I actually am really proud of the work, and I'm really proud of the work that everyone put into it. And I think it's a really unique show. Like, I told this to the cast on opening night, and I meant every word of it. Like, there aren't a lot of plays out there that you can see right now that are like this, partly because it is a throwback to another time, but also because he had a vision that no one else has really ever had, that we know of, at least. I mean, I can't think of any other modern theater maker, but I can't think of any other modernist to mid-century theater maker who really, excuse me, has captured, like, has found the humane side of existentialism, and been able to convey it dramatically the way that Ionesco does. I find his work less caustic than Sartre's, for instance. Ionesco has a kind of like gentleness to his existentialism that makes me feel like he is compassionate towards his subject matter. Sartre is much more critical, and I think Sartre has his place, but like that definitely. And I actually love Jean Genet, who I'd also throw into that group too. But Jean Genet is just has a bleak outlook. You know?
Yeah, prison probably had an effect on him too in that way.
Oh, absolutely. And being a marginalized people certainly had an effect on him as well. But like, you know, and being a criminal himself probably had an effect on him.
Absolutely.
But you know, and Genet's work falls into what I would consider like transgressive work. But you know, Ionesco somehow managed to create theater with, for lack of a better way of putting it, bourgeois appeal,
right.
but harder lessons to learn than most bourgeois theater has to offer.
So it's sort of like bougie edge.
Yeah, he's got bouge edge. And I actually like that about him. Like I think it's important that we not forget that everybody has value and has valuable things to learn. You know?
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you brought up Sartre because the two of them were known to have a very sort of quarrelsome relationship. And
that doesn't shock me, yeah.
And Ionesco actually said in an interview, which I posted on my blog right along with this, with the plug for your show, and this interview will be there as well, where he ever so gently calls Sartre a political poser.
Right.
And mentions how Sartre kind of flip-flopped around and sort of grabbed onto the ideas that were working for him, very much in a survivalist artistic way, which we get. But at the same time, I think Ionesco was so much more comfortable with his beliefs and his ideas that he didn't have to pound it into anybody. He just presented them because he stood behind them solidly, and that was his point that he was saying about Sartre, is he just didn't believe that Sartre was necessarily authentic.
Right, and again, I think I think the authenticity that comes through in Ionesco is his humanity. Like he doesn't think that these things are valuable unless they have something to give us to make our lives more livable. Right, like that was really Ionesco's point with existentialism, is that, you know, life is meaningless, but also it's incredibly meaningful as a result. You know, because we bring all this meaning to it. I think for him it was about being conscious and living more consciously, whereas I think with Sartre has that kind of petulance that is really about tearing stuff down for other people.
But what they both have, and I appreciate, and most people do that suffer, you know, either in their environment or politically or sexually as well, is they have a very strong sense of humor. So no matter how deep and dark it gets, they are able to pepper it with these little gems of humor that I also see, especially in this play. It's when you can find those little nuggets of humor and really work them, it just makes the whole thing just blossom into this amazing experience.
Well, I think the difference is this. You know, I think Sartre is actually like dripping with irony, and irony can sometimes be very, very funny. With Ionesco, the humor to me comes out more of the recognition of the sheer ridiculousness of everything. Like, and the example I use is this. Like, this sounds so funny, but this is what this play means to me. So, like,
perfect.
A couple of years ago, I was just going through a bit of a rough patch in my life, and like, I've been kind of doing some like really heavy drinking at the time, and I was just I've been using, you know, it's just been a little bit more self-medicating than I should have been, and I knew that there was kind of a problem, and so I went back to therapy because I was like, this is not who I want to be. And my therapist at one point was like, listen, I know I don't really think you have a problem. I think you're just going through a rough patch in your life. But I would like you to attend a couple group harm reduction meetings. And I was like, sure. She's like, I think you'll get a lot out of them. And so I went to these harm reduction meetings, which were for people who are at any point on the spectrum of questioning their substance use of any kind. You could be there for smoking too many joints. You could be there for like shooting heroin into your eyeballs. Like anyone was allowed to come in. Right. So it was like, it really ran the gamut. And I'm like sitting there, like listening to these people share kind of what happened. And, you know, and for the most part, it really worked because it actually helped me realize how much more in control of my life I actually was.
Yes.
Like, you know, like I was like, oh my God, these are people who are like, you know, and it was a good
perspective.
warning. It was like, don't become one of these people if you can help it, right? Like,
yeah.
But also, like, there was this one day, and this was kind of the day that I knew I was better, if that makes sense. Like, because I had been down on myself about, like, you know, like, oh, whatever, I missed a day at work. And so, I basically, because what I was struggling with was this idea that I wasn't always going to be as strong or as productive or as perfect as I could be. You know, it's been really hard for me sometimes to accept my own limitations. And so the real problem for me was not so much that I was drinking too much or whatever. It was, the real problem was that I was so down on myself for doing it that I was running the danger of of embracing it too much. Instead of being the guy who's like, so, you know what, I'm going to take a break. I was kind of teetering on the brink of being the guy who's like, I'm just going to throw myself headfirst into the bog because I've already ruined everything, you know?
Oh, God,
and,
yeah.
Yeah, so I think that was really what my therapist was trying to get me to understand. Like, you have so much more agency in this than you think you do. And seeing other people's struggles and learning how they compromise their own agency through various long lines of choices was really helpful. But to get back to why this comes back to Exit the King.
Yeah.
So the day I kind of knew, and it was the last time I ever showed up to one of these meetings because I felt better after that. I felt like I knew what I needed to do and how to do it. Like, you know, this guy is talking about his crystal meth use.
Yeah.
And he's talking about smoking, you know, crystal meth through a pipe. And he says, you know, God, like, I'm just so worried that I'm going to get gangrene from a pipe and my lips are going to fall off. And I just started laughing. And everyone looks at me. And I was like, so sorry. I don't mean to feel that. Like, that is a real fear. He's like, it can happen. And I said, but don't you, I was like, okay, for a moment, sir. Just, you know, because the poor group leader is sitting there looking at me and like, please turn this into a teachable moment, you know?
Yeah. Turn this around quickly.
Right. But like, I was like, don't you see, like, you're smoking crystal meth. Like, so many other things are likely to happen before your lips fall off. And like, I'm not saying that can't happen, but to me, that's like being afraid of getting, I don't know, to me, that's like being afraid of being swallowed by a whale when like our beaches are covered in hypodermic needles.
Yes.
You know, it's like, I was like, it's to me, I'm like, I told, and I was like, don't you see how that's funny? That's what you're worried about.
I see how it's funny, but.
Yeah, and he looked at me and he goes, no, I'm really scared of it. And I said, okay, you're right. And I backed down immediately. I said, I'm so sorry. This is not me. But afterwards, I was talking to the group leader. I said, I apologize. And she was like, no. She was like, I actually see what you're saying, and I don't think you were even rude about it. She was like, I just think, you know, maybe that's an important thing for you to realize is that if you have the ability to step outside yourself and see the absurdity, that's your foothold into coming to terms with whatever it is you need to come to terms with.
Yes.
And that to me is what INS is doing in Exit the King. He's stepping outside himself numerous times. And he's pointing out just how absurd death really is, and age, and the fear of death, and the fear of age, and also everything in our culture that we do to protect ourselves from that fear, and also to comfort ourselves. Like, there's a whole...
Our vanity is huge. Like, we cling to our beauty when we know we're all going to die looking like a wreck, you know, or
whatever. Or even if we don't die looking like a wreck, even if we die looking perfect, like, who's that for?
Right, who cares at that point? Yeah.
Yeah, and like, he has this whole sequence that I call the funeral sequence, where basically they perform a funeral while the king is still alive. And it really illustrates how much of our culture is, like, religion and so forth, is based around just comforting people.
Yes.
You know, with this thing, but also a lot of times it's just empty platitudes. All that stuff just sounds like ornate nonsense at the end of the day.
Yes.
If you really start to listen to it. And then just when you think he's being really callous about something, he will throw in something really beautiful. Like, there is this moment where the character, right after the funeral sequence, when he really is kind of falling apart, and they make him sit down in the wheelchair for the first time. And in our production, every time the wheelchair comes on stage, we accompany it with a guillotine sound because they associate the wheelchair with that's the beginning of the actual end. Like, once you're in the wheelchair, you're done, right?
Right. It's like adult diapers.
Right, exactly. And so, when he sits in the wheelchair for the first time, he does have this one really beautiful moment where he says, I used to really love Mozart. I'll never hear that music again. And that moment is very real and really beautiful, because that is the tragedy. And what Ionesco is trying to tell you is, all this other stuff you're worried about, the pain, the whatever, none of that stuff matters compared to just, there are these things that you will do for the last time. And some of those things were things that really did matter, because they mattered to you. And my boyfriend, I was sitting next to my boyfriend on opening night, and he cried. That was when he cried, was because he was he was I think about that all the time. That it's not so much death that is terrifying to me. It's just the sadness of not doing something I love anymore, or not hearing it again, how do we let go of the things that mean so much to us is actually the real source of anxiety around death. Part of also what, Ionesco points out is that if you live your whole life trying to extend that relationship as long as possible, the truth is, after a while, it won't mean very much to you. So, Berenger has actually lived for 400 years. He's had plenty of time to listen to Mozart, and he hasn't been listening to Mozart. Queen Marguerite really points that out at one point, where she says, you have had all the time in the world, and he says it wasn't enough. And on one level, we will always feel that way. No matter how well you've lived your life, you will always feel that way, right? Or most of us will feel that way.
And it's just like art. It's never finished. You think it's finished, but it could always be a little bit better. And it's sort of like that. It's when do you stop and just let it be what it is?
Have you ever read the story Leaf by Niggle by Tolkien?
No, but tell me about it.
So this is one of my favorite short stories ever. So Tolkien, obviously Lord of the Rings, is what he's most known for. But the thing that Tolkien's actually really most known for in literary circles is having a bottomless drawer full of stuff he never finished.
Yes.
It's kind of a miracle that the Lord of the Rings was finished, because he loved storytelling, and he loved stories, and he was a very slow writer. And he was never, ever really satisfied with what he wrote. So he was also a heavy reviser. And that's how, since he's died, we've had 3 novels published, that are essentially written, but he just never felt like they were good enough. And, and he has this short story that was published during his lifetime, which is just this lovely story about this guy, an artist named Niggle, who is trying to paint, he sets out trying to paint the perfect leaf.
Oh dear.
And that slowly turns into trying to paint the perfect tree, and then that turns into trying to paint the perfect forest, which turns into trying to paint the perfect world, until suddenly he's working on something so big he'll never possibly finish it. And then life interferes with everything, as it does, and long story short, he ends up dying. Everyone he knows dies. And a storm destroys his huge canvas, except all that's left is one little section which perfectly illustrates a perfect leaf. And these 2 guys are walking in a field near the ruins in his house, and they find it, and they put it in the local museum with a little placard that says Leaf by Niggle, and it becomes the only thing of his to ever get into a museum, and it's actually the thing he started out trying to do, but lost sight of, And I find that story deeply, deeply funny, and also incredibly sad.
But so relatable. I mean, how many times have you second guessed yourself creatively and then and go on this little journey, and then you come back right to the first choice that you made, your instinctual choice, right? It happens so often. So, okay, so let's wrap up this interview. This one more question is, and this is something that I've always been curious about, especially with you, but other people as well. how do you time manage? You do so much work. How do you just do your everyday stuff? Like right now you're in your pajamas drinking tea, but like how often are you able to just kind of do normal people things, if that makes sense?
First of all, what are normal people doing?
Right?
Second of all, maintaining relationships is huge for me. Like I have friends who are not in the theater community. That's been really important over the years to really keep that. My friend Rob is like, I refer to him as my lawyer friend because he's a lawyer instead of a theater person.
Very useful
but, like,
friends.
I've known him for a very long time. I'm lucky that he lives locally in San Francisco, and so like, he's someone who I try to just always maintain a good friendship with because he reminds me that there's bigger things in the world than this. When you have good friends, time management is more of an imperative because you want to spend time with those people. And it's so important to me to maintain relationships that making sure I prioritize my schedule in a way that allows for me to have free time to spend with people is really, really important.
Yeah.
Also, having a relationship that I've been in for over 10 years now, I mean, he's an artist, but he's not a theater person. And again, like making sure that we always have time is important and helps me prioritize my schedule. But it really just comes down to very unromantic, unsexy things like you learn to keep a calendar.
Yes,
you learn to keep a calendar,
things.
and you learn to actually check it.
Yes,
that was the
yes.
thing that it took me a little while to learn is you can't just walk around with a calendar. You actually have to put stuff in it.
Yeah.
And then before you say yes to stuff, you have to reopen it and look at it and make sure that you have the time.
Yes.
So,
it's amazing when we figure these things out. Well, thank you so much, Stuart. I am really excited to see the show tonight. I'm excited to see all of it coming together. I know that Marjorie worked on some of the movement for the show, which I think is crucial because this show it's almost, I don't want to say dance theater, but there is so much physicality to it that brings
there was a moment early in rehearsal where I just was watching. I was blocking, and I said, "You know what? There's someone who can do this so much better than me." And I immediately turned around to Christina and said, "Do we have a budget to hire Marjorie?"
Yes.
I was really glad Marjorie could work on this. Her work is super valuable to the show.
And I want to say that you both are super valuable to me, not only as peers in theater, but also as what I would consider friends. I've known you both for many years. You were one of my first theater love interests.
I know, it's true.
Yeah.
You were my last.
And, right, I mean, that was such a rare moment to meet you as an actor because that really wasn't what your hat normally was.
And I'm very rarely cast as romantic leads when I am an actor, so It was a rare moment of having a leading lady in a show.
Such a funny moment. But I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about you and the show, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you do next. So thank you so much,
Thank you so much
Stuart.
for talking to me, Sarah.
Okay, bye.
Bye.